The day they fired me, the floor beneath me cracked like glass, and every shard whispered the same verdict. Ridiculous. They told me my dream was a joke, that I was chasing wind while the real world bled. I had stood with a recording rig slung over my shoulder, a field notebook thick with locations and names nobody could pronounce. And I'd promised the world that sound could heal what sight had already broken. Then the partners gathered in the glass atrium and cut me loose, as if the air itself could be cleaned by erasing me from the payroll. They called it a hobby, a crutch, a fantasy. I stood there and learned what betrayal sounds like, the soft click of a door, the louder click of a closing future. That moment was my painful departure. I left with nothing but a battered backpack and a stubborn fire in my chest, the kind of spark that refuses to be extinguished even when mocked by your own kin. My family had mocked me for years. "You're chasing rain in a jar," my brother would say. "You want to save a bird with a microphone?" The kind of laughter that cuts deeper than any insult because it comes from people you love and trust. They called ecological sound restoration a punchline, a fad, a betrayal of common sense. They didn't understand that my work wasn't about pretty noises or a fevered hobby. It was a map, a way to locate and heal the places we had forced into silence. I paid the price of their disbelief in every mile I walked away from that building. I started by listening to the land the way you listen to a friend who's drowning out a truth you don't want to hear. I traveled to wetlands drowned in fertilizer fog, canyons where wind carried the memory of birds that no longer sang, forests where the undergrowth had learned to hush because every creature knew the poison in the air. I learned to read the silence as a species does a heartbeat. The ridicule didn't vanish. It echoed back in the first grants I missed, in the second-loudest chair at the conference I crashed, in the evenings when the hotel coffee tasted like defeat. But I wasn't after applause. I was after the first crack of sound when the land woke up. The ascent was a brutal lullaby. We built recordings that didn't just capture sound. They coaxed ecosystems back to life. Endangered soundscapes became a language we could teach to the soil, to the trees, to the river that had forgotten how to murmur. Folks who'd told me I'd failed now asked for tours of the sites, which felt like a strange kind of revenge. And I learned to accept success without surrendering the quiet humility that had carried me through the long nights of fieldwork. There were days when the data refused to cooperate, when the machine hummed with a wage slave's stubbornness, and the funding tossed me to and fro like a leaf in a storm. Still, I kept faith with the discipline of listening, the discipline of pairing science with story, the discipline of letting culture and memory ride the same ridge of sound. The work began to matter beyond the charts and the headlines. We didn't just restore the health of streams. We revived ancestral songs and childhood sounds that culture had started to forget. Communities learned to tell their histories through the chorus of wind through reeds, the crackle of a campfire, the laughter of grandchildren near a restored wetland. The field no longer looked like a niche. It became a lifeline for people who'd learned to measure value by the number of trees left standing and the number of voices still resonating in the valley. And yes, I became something the old me would scarcely recognize, not merely a scientist, but a guardian of sound, the keeper of a memory that could anchor a future. Then came the moment when I knew the ledger of karma would be settled. We planned a large-scale restoration in a region that had been stripped of its songlands, that had endured bulldozers and cutthroat developers. The kind of place that makes people believe the earth can be bought back only with more money and more power. We invited the local council, the indigenous stewards, the school children who learned to listen before they learned to talk. And I asked one thing of them. Listen as if your future depends on it. because it does. When we played back the first composite of living soundbirds learning the daylight again, the river waking, the grasses exhaling after a drought, the valley released something primal, as if the land itself remembered what it had forgotten to say. Now, years later, I return home not as the disruptive outsider my family warned would fail, but as the person they taught me I could never be. The road unwinds to the outskirts of our old town, where the hills still cradle the river and the air still carries the faint sting of rain on dust. I walk into my parents' living room, and I can feel the gravity of a room that has learned to anticipate failure more than wonder. They didn't come to the opening of the new reserve. They came because they could not ignore what had become of me, the son who had promised to turn sound into land and land into breath. The scene unfolds like a memory I didn't know I could own. I lead them to the meadow behind the house, where once the family picnics were quieter than a church choir in midsummer, and I play the installation I built for that barren landscape. It's not loud. It's a low, patient river of sound, layered with the calls of birds that rarely survived, now returned in numbers that make the trees ripple with life. The speakers are hidden in the grass, and the valley becomes a living instrument. My father, who had whispered in derisive laughter about my hobby, stands there with a mouth that cannot find a joke and eyes that finally fear losing something they didn't realize they'd found. My mother's hands tremble as if she's clutching an old photograph that suddenly feels real again. And then the consequences come home in the chorus of returning life. A heron lands on the edge of the stream and then lifts, heavy with a dignity that says, "I survived your doubt." A fox steps from the undergrowth and pauses to listen, as if listening is a form of reverence. The air changes, slower, deeper, honest. My sister, who once teased me for chasing wind, weeps softly when a particular bird call, one I saved from oblivion, rises like a memory spoken aloud. The room shifts with the undeniable truth that I did not fail. I redirected a current of failure into a ditch that finally filled with rain. The derision has become fertilizer for something far greater than I could have imagined. Was it worth it? My mother asks, voice rough with relief and years of practice at hiding fear and affection. Worth every sleepless night, I tell her, and I mean it more than words can carry. Because the soundscape is a map. It led me home to you, and it led you to listen. Karma isn't a thunderclap. It's a patient ledger, inscribed in the quiet places where life revives. The family's laughter, once a weapon, becomes a strange comfort, their voices finally aligned with the truth I carry. That healing isn't a miracle, but a practice. And practice is a discipline that asks for faith when sight betrays you. The lands I saved sing back to me in the breath of the meadow, in the crackle of cattails, in the soft, persistent chorus of birds that still have a story to tell. The family witnesses, not my triumph alone, but the dawn that follows the long, hard night when belief was ridiculed as foolishness. I tell them what I've learned. It isn't enough to prove them wrong. I had to prove to the earth that our hearts can harmonize with it if we learn to listen without fear. The field of acoustic ecology, once dismissed as mere hobbyism, becomes a language of restoration and memory. We can heal what sight overlooks. We can gift a future where children grow up hearing a land that remembers to sing. And in that memory, I recognize the final truth. The dream you're mocked for may be the compass that guides you to your real work, the work that makes you worthy of your own name. I am not an embarrassment. I am the bridge between what human hands have damaged and what human hearts can repair. The meadow keeps its promises, the river keeps its witness, and I keep mine, To listen, to heal, to return, and to teach that the most stubborn cynics can become the loudest chorus when they choose to hear.